everyone, welcome to another daily objective. And tonight's objective is to understand what makes progress possible. Because specifically my generation and our generation have considered progress as something self-evident, as something that just happens out there. So quite often I think that my students were born and the internet and the smartphone were just there. But actually, progress has been not the rule, but the exception throughout the history of humanity. And tonight we have with us someone who has, in a way, made it his intellectual mission to understand progress and to understand what makes it possible. So today we have Johan Norberg with us, an author and a historian of ideas. And his latest book is, I have it in Kindle version, Open. And it's a book that the story of human progress. And I think the title is self-explanatory and tries to see what is the key that makes progress possible. And I've read this book, and it's a very interesting, in a way, dialogue with other people who have studied the same topic, people like Jerry McCluskey or Matt Ridley. So it's a very, very important book. And it also has references to the events of the last months, references to COVID, for example. So it's very, very up to date, and I encourage people to have a look at it. But also with us today is investor, but also thinker, Jonathan Hoenig, who will be my co-host. So many thanks to our guest and our co-host. So,
Thank
Johan,
you.
So you mentioned in the book that it's not so much things like technology or ideas or the accumulation of capital, so not the usual explanations that we have for what makes progress possible. It's openness, and you say openness in terms of what's happening inside here in our minds, but also open trade, open societies, open immigration. Do you want to explain us a bit what you mean by openness and why you consider it such an important aspect of progress?
Yeah, because I think that so many economic historians have contributed important material to understanding the world's progress, but they've often focused on particular innovations or sources of energy and so on. I think that starts somewhere. It starts with particular institutions that make it possible, institutions that open up for human creativity and rationality and exchange, and that in turn is dependent on particular ideas, particular attitudes to which kinds of institutions are good and bad, moral and immoral. And that's why when I look at human history, we have particular instances here and there of human flourishing, of efflorescences, when we have rapid increase in innovation, scientific knowledge, and of productivity economically. But they often peter out because there's always this internal debate within those societies. Should they welcome these creations, even if they threaten incumbents? Could be intellectual, religious incumbents, could be commercial or political incumbents, or should we close it down to protect what we already had? And whenever that openness has been destroyed, it has undermined those civilizations as well. And that's why I think it's a history book, but it's really relevant to our times.
So, Jonathan, you are someone who you live in, let's say, the economy, and it's a thing you're a specialist in. So, how important do you think openness is, and how do you understand the term? So,
yeah, Nikos, well, I'm just angry that Johan is here, because we all know that he's a globalist, right? I mean, that's we talk about openness. Johan, I know part of what you write about in the book, which I recommend, I've read excerpts, is the importance of global trade as promoting progress. But these days, you as someone who supports global trade and openness in trade, I don't know if you're worse than a pedophile, but you're kind of on that level, right? I mean, you're destroying jobs, you're ruining the environment, you're hurting people's lives. How do you respond to that charge? Very common, even among those who say they support capitalism, that, Johan, you're just a globalist.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we've heard throughout history as well in this debate. And you're really sort of rephrasing it in the kind of way that we heard in Ming China as well in the 16th century, or in the Abbasid Caliphate in the 1000 years ago. Because some people always said that, no, don't be global, because it's kind of a way of selling out to the others, to strange people, other groups, other tribes. We should stick to our own. But the thing is, when you read the records of world history and economics today, is that any kind of trade and exchange is about benefiting us. Being global, being open, is not some sort of generosity, it's not altruism, it's a way of making sure that we can benefit from the brains and the skills and the hard work, the goods and services, technologies of other people as well, and not just stick to what we can come up with here. And every time then that people have said sort of, you know, the Abbasid Caliphate first, or the Ming China first, it has just meant that they've shut themselves off. They cut themselves off from all those sources of energy, of talent and innovation that took place in other places, and they ruined it for themselves.
So one of the most quote controversial, but for many people will be, even for liberals, controversial part in your book is where you say that immigration is actually even more important in a way than free trade. And you provide some statistics that says that if by free trade, let's say we get X amount of more GDP, with free immigration would get 8 times this. So I will try to give you the best argument of the other side. And actually, this is something that I had a discussion with someone who identifies as a nationalist, and he asked me, Nikos, you love Athens. By what percentage of people in Athens who are going to be immigrants, Athens is not anymore going to be Athens? Is it 20%, 30%, 50%? And where he was getting at, is there up to a point where immigration so much influences the identity, or however you want to call it, of a place, that it's not anymore, quote, our place?
Yeah. You could make that theoretical case, and you can make those theoretical experiments, obviously, but it's all dependent on the idea that the immigrants come up with some sort of culture and an attitude that is contrary to what you already had in Athens, for example. And it wouldn't be difficult to come up with those kinds of examples. But when you look at it empirically, when you have open borders, and by that I mean open borders to people who want to make a life and a living for themselves and for their loved ones, they do not come there to live off the expense of others through a generous welfare state. And obviously criminals and others are stopped at the borders. In that case, what we see is that there's a bias. Those who leave their own place are not, in most instances, those who are most traditionalist, authoritarian, tribalist, sectarian in various ways. Think about it yourself. If something terrible happened to Athens or wherever you happen to be, who would be the first ones who would sort of pick up the sticks and move to somewhere else and depend on their own ingenuity, their talent, and being open to associating with people who speak a language that you don't? Well, it's probably those who are the most innovative, entrepreneurial, and open to what you have in Athens or in other places.
And ambitious. I mean, Harry Binslater, I know, Nikos, you might know, has done some wonderful work on this, is that, you know, immigration attracts those ambitious, poor, and all I know is just so many of my investors who are all very wealthy are either immigrants or the children of immigrants who came here in many cases not owning the language. Now they own real estate in millions. But Johan, I want to ask, you know, why is it now, I feel it even, that the tribalism is thundering? You know, it was always that kind of, you know, America first thing. But people also said, hey, it's pretty cool to buy things on Amazon from China or where else. It's pretty cool to have an Ethiopian restaurant open in my block. And, you know, it's cool to be part of the, why has the pendulum now seemed to be swung so far towards this really, I consider, abhorrent tribalism?
Yeah, it's very worrying, and I'm trying to explain it in the book. And what I think is that there is a somewhat disconnect between a modern, open, complex world, dependent on thousands of exchanges just to produce this computer or this glass of water. It's a disconnect between that wonderful result of our ingenuity and our Stone Age brains trying to comprehend it. And, you know, I'm in favor of Stone Age brains. I'm pro Stone Age brains because they got us this far. They had to have something wonderful in them. But they did have a problem. The evolution took place in a situation where quite often the others were not someone who, when they became more powerful or rich or wealthy or learned, or it didn't benefit you. It meant that they could kill you more easily. It meant they were raiding tribe. So we have this almost instinctual habit of, when we see strange things happening, we're worried about the world, we look to the strong man to protect us. We have this societal fight or flight instinct where we want to just kill the others. And, you know, that's fine if the others are an invading tribe. But if the others are someone who can come up with important scientific knowledge, a vaccine against a terrible disease, or a better computer for you, it means that you hurt yourself when you do that. But I think we always have that disconnect, and especially in the times of trouble, or at least seeming trouble, a crisis. That's what we see historically, at least. Societies face natural disasters, great depressions, pandemics, and so on. We trigger that fight or flight instinct. And I think we might be there now with, you know, after the financial crisis, global terrorism, geopolitical concerns, and then Twitter sort of broadcasting this all over constantly. We're afraid, and then we want to kill someone and get protection by the big government.
And I'll also just say, I think our intellectuals unfortunately feed it. They feed the zero-sum mentality that, hey, if China's getting rich, it's at your expense. If this guy's got it, it's because he's screwing you. I'm sorry, I've been reprimanded on this program already. So we're fighting it on the, would you say, on the intellectual level as well?
That's exactly it. And that's the major problem. We find it so incredibly hard to understand that the world is not a zero-sum game. The myth of the zero-sum game is really the myth that launched 1,000 mistakes about the economy, about technology, about globalization and free trade and migration, because then you always think that if someone gets rich, he took it from you. And then you always need to fight. You always need protection by someone. If people understood a little bit about economics, that would go such a long way to save the civilization, I think.
Here's a question though, Johan, and to Jonathan as well. So the big question is, what comes first? Ideas, technology, politics? So I really found interesting your idea in the book of the cracks. So there's this crack, there's this, let's say, gap where the hand of the state cannot reach you, then something develops there, and then it becomes so big that it's difficult for it to be suppressed. And the thing that came to mind was obviously Uber, because that was in a way the story. But at the end of the day, if ideas don't follow technology, then technology is not going to save us. So remember the optimism of the libertarians 6-7 years ago, or about Bitcoin, or about blockchain. So what does define whether a society will have openness, if not ideas? So the thing I didn't understand 100%. So do you consider the mover of history, let's say, philosophy and ideas, or something else that comes with them?
That's an excellent question. I'd be very interested in hearing Jonathan's take on this as well. But my personal one is that I think it's an interaction where they feed each other, because I think the cracks, they have been incredibly important historically. And as one of my favorite thinkers, Leonard Cohen, puts it, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. That's how the Uber gets in. That's how the internet got in. That's how vaccination, that's how the printing press, basically secular science, all of it. Had we had a majority vote on should we have this or shouldn't we, these disturbers of the peace, innovations and so on, or just let the establishment decide, it would have been banned every single time. But often they slip through the cracks. And if they did for a sufficiently long time, or if they built the constituency like Uber, then they got to prove that they were essential to our well-being. And then people's minds changed, and there was an effect where it became more important and influential in society. Sometimes that began to change the mentality and the atmosphere and the culture of the sense of life of a culture, if you will. And then intellectuals and others began to look upon the world anew and see that, look, there are points, there are great things about this, innovation, individualism, and so on. So let's defend this, and then it became longer lasting. But it wasn't enough if ideas weren't changed to a sufficient extent, because then what happened is that you have this cultural establishment at the writers, the religious thinkers, the priests, the universities, who are basically in opposition to the productive forces of society. And that's a kind of a civil war that one party has to lose eventually.
Well, I mean, if you look at the innovators of today, among them, the tech giants, both political parties are at least seem to line against them. There's antagonism. Quickly, and I don't want to monopolize, but is it the culture spurs the innovation spurs the culture? I mean, Nikos, I'm just thankful at the end of the day. I'm selfish. I'm thankful that I'm living during this period, which unfortunately I think is on the decline, and not during the dark ages. And the advancements we have at our fingertips, and Johan, that's why I recommend your book and you as an intellectual to follow on social media, is that I think you, in your knowledge of history, are one of the few intellectuals who are kind of, I read a story this morning about how many young people, for example, aren't even aware of the Holocaust, let alone aware of how damn fortunate we are to live at this time of history with all the technical innovation brought to us by the reasoning West, the thinking mind. So thank you for taking the time in your books and your work to kind of bring us back to realize just how lucky we have it, thanks to our imperfect, but semi-open, you would say, society and morality, and how important it is to keep and build on that from where we are.
So thanks. That means a lot to me, and it's important because you cannot take progress for granted. That's the whole point of writing about human progress. If it were automatic, we could just sort of relax and do something else, but it's not. And if we continue to have a cultural attitude, an atmosphere of ideas that fights against the thing that keeps us alive and well, something's got to give.
Uber busted through, but at least now where I live, Uber is hamstrung by city tax and city regulation and this regulation and that regulation. So it hasn't really busted through as an example of the free marketplace at work yet.
Yeah, so they fixed the cracks, unfortunately.
One last question that I want to ask both of you, and has to do with where we are now and how we get out of this, in a way, dark place with COVID and in the States with the tribalism and all that stuff. By the way, Johan's book is also part of it, although it's not its main focus.
Show us the cover, if you would, sir. Let's see it.
This is the Swedish edition.
But this captures the critique of tribalism, which is another level that this book is very, very good. And the objectivist audience will particularly appreciate how you, in a way, you present tribalism as the antithesis of self-esteem and as two forces that strike with each other. But you said something very interesting about COVID and about pandemics in general, that the number one effect of pandemics is the fear of associating with each other. And I still see this in the world out there. And now we're in a stage of this pandemic that we are again on the reaction side. So more regulations. So when do you think that we will get out? What will it take for societies to burst through this? Is it going to be the vaccine, or is the psychological impact of all this so big, or the government's power are so big that it's not only gonna take the physical victory over the virus for us to go through it. Question open to both of you.
Yeah, we'll see about that. First, let me just sort of reinforce what you mentioned, because the World Bank calculated before this pandemic in 2014 that up to 90% of the economic damage of pandemics and epidemics generally does not come from death, disease, treatment, and the associate loss of production when people stay home. 90% of it comes instead from this fear of associating with other people, which means that we don't go to work because we're afraid of getting sick there. We don't go to stores, harbors, airports are closed down. Basically, the anti-globalists, they win out. So it's a combination of it's a utopia of sort of, you know, Greta Thunberg combined with Donald Trump. No one is flying, no one is moving, no one's migrating, no trade. And look, it was a trailer for that kind of an anti-globalist world. And do you really want to see the full motion picture after that? Because this was pretty awful. We shut down the world for 3 months, and the result is already a global depression, increased poverty, and hunger around the world. So that should tell us why we shouldn't take it for granted, the things that are being created by a global economy. So how do we get out of it? Well, my guess is that we'll probably get out of it in just the same kind of irrational way that we got into it, because we didn't shut down cities, businesses, countries, because we had an objective assessment of the risk, the transmission, the state of the healthcare system in a particular place. There are several researchers who've looked into this. There's no connection, basically. The only connection that you can see is that when your neighbors start to shut down, when the neighboring country does it, you do it as well. So it's just a herd mentality, basically. And many governments just abandoned all their plans that they had for a pandemic, which were more similar to the Swedish strategy, sort of protect those who are most vulnerable, try to keep society open. But the moment everybody else started to shut down, you don't want to be the only one staying open, right? Because you might be right, and that's good, but you might be wrong. And it's so much worse to be the one person, the one country who did the mistake. It's much better to be mistaken along with everybody else. I think that's the general assumption. And I think that's how it's going to end as well. I think a vaccine is definitely going to help. But the one thing that's really going to help is a couple of states are going to open up and it's going to work. A couple of countries are going to do it, and kids are going back to school, and you'll see that it was overblown, the fear, and then everybody else will just follow along because the climate of opinion will change in a very rational way. No, yeah, well.
Let's hope. Jonathan.
Well, I mean, I'll quickly just kind of bring myself back to really the depths of the shutdowns in the spring of this year. And, you know, it's hyperbolic, I think, the way that people bring up the Holocaust as the worst of example. I'm not going to say that seeing the global supply chain was like seeing the World Trade Tower destroyed, because it's not the same, but it was so, it's painful when you see things aren't available, when you see barren shelves, when you see people out of work, when you see businesses, ships that you are normally running full of goods. And it kind of gets back to, you know, this objectivist notion of political power versus economic power, and you know, and how Rand talked about you should celebrate those smokestacks, those dirty smokestacks, and so just seeing that supply chain and seeing the anti-trade voices out there, it's like personally painful in a very hard to describe way, because I consider that, you know, as someone who invests, to see the global supply chain, it's amazing, and how all these risks are moved and transferred. You know, you can buy commodities linked to the cost of shipping. You can hedge yourself in these fantastic ways, and that's what makes that jar of Skippy available on your shelf day in, day out. And to understand the kind of the global nature of it, Johan, that's what you do such a great job of doing. So thanks for that work. And let's hope that, you know, big picture, we can keep moving towards a more open society as you talk about.
I think that's a great point. And I do agree in both ways. It's not like seeing sort of the Twin Towers collapse on an emotion level, but if you have this sense of understanding of what it means, functioning supply chains in terms of creating and sustaining life, and if you have that kind of abstract reasoning in it, then you almost get this, become sick in the same way physically when
like
you see no one's
millions
buying
and millions of beneficial win-win relationships that you can't even compute how many millions of people are affected when you see that type of destruction. It can't help but hurt.
That's right. And in the long run, many more people will lose their lives than lost their lives on 9/11 because when we shut down the world like that.
So as an outro, let me say that while I was reading the book, I found even myself, who I consider myself immune, let's say, from these bad ideas. Thinking about my last months, because I work in jobs that I can work from abroad, my first reaction was fly to Greece. And then my plan was, well, unless the university opens, I'll stay here forever. Like I have my group here, my network here. So there's nothing bad on that level, but when this becomes your worldview, then it's a problem. And something that this book make me think is how easy it is for this to become your worldview. So I would encourage our audience to check this book out and struggle in a way with the ideas in the book, because it's not that it's these people out there who are the bad people and we are the good people and there's a clear line. The line quite often, and I think you mentioned in the book, is here in our head. So the book we discussed is Johan Norberg's Open, The Story of Human Progress. You can find the link also on the comments on our Facebook Live. So Johan and Jonathan, thank you so much. And hopefully next time we talk, it's about something super exciting and something that's going to make our lives so much better. I mean, the book will make our lives so much better, but I mean, on the front of the pandemic or something like that. So many thanks. Many thanks to our audience. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikos.